whenever you are.
Okay, great. And one question, should I look at this the camera?
Yeah, so this is the camera. You can look at the camera, but also just
okay. Yeah, I'm not going to be weird. Like an anchor woman. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I see the green light. So I can still work out. So we're going to go on and get started. Thank y'all so much for coming today to talk about the power, or I call it power to the trees, like power to the people, the power to the trees, because they have so many meanings. And for me, what I've noticed in the 21 years that I've been in horticulture is that you really got to meet people where they are. And so one of those things that has been very illuminating to me is that we have a very great academic understanding of trees and a very great environmental understanding. But what I believe that we lack in the United States of America specifically is a real cultural understanding of trees and how cultures interacted with trees the thousands of years before we really started, recording these records the past 200 years. And there's many different ways. So today I'm going to speak to a variety of ways that historically Black culture interacted with trees. And most of this will be pre-1940s. But I don't not think that we shouldn't get back to some of these elements because you never know what touches a person. And whatever that is going to be is going to engage them and want to bring them into the Arboretum. It may be that cultural understanding. So that's how I'm going to speak to today. And the first thing I want to talk about is establishing trees and a sense of place. So the woman that you see here is a woman named Mary P. This is a Black woman who had a Black mother, and her father was a French, and her mother was a free Black woman at the time. And this is a woman who lived in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. The interesting thing about Mary P is that she started teaching under this tree that you see here, and this tree is called the Emancipation Oak. So when people think about the angel oak in South Carolina, a tree that we should all be thinking about equally is the Emancipation Oak, which sits at the entrance to Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. The reason this tree is so important is because the first Southern reading of the Emancipation Proclamation happened under this tree. Now, when Mary P started teaching under this tree as a free Black woman, she was teaching newly freed slaves education. What we have to remember about slavery is that it was at one point illegal for a Black person to be able to read or write. At best, you might lose your eyes before your hand. At worst, you could absolutely lose your life. And so, with the Emancipation Oath, she establishes this school, which goes on to be Hampton University. And this is essentially the school that launches Black horticultural education for America. It's the school that Booker T. Washington graduates from, and he goes on to establish Tuskegee. So, in establishing a sense of place for trees, just understanding what this means to Black culture and what it means to America. And Black tree history is American tree history, so we should all feel that same level of excitement and understanding. Now, I mentioned the Emancipation Oak, and these ladies that you see right here in their super cool 1960s fashion that they're giving us today, this is Irma Thompson and Elizabeth, I forgot Elizabeth's last, Elizabeth Hines. Irma Thompson is on the left, Elizabeth Hines is on the right. Now, these women were members of what were called the Negro Garden Club of Virginia back at the time. So Virginia is super duper important to American horticulture, from Thomas Jefferson to the Negro Garden Club of Virginia to the Emancipation Oak and many other things. And the Clark Oak that you see, there's probably some people saying, I've never heard of a Clark Oak, and you're right, you haven't. This tree, the Clark Oak, what these women did is that they collected seeds from the Emancipation Oak. So the oak tree where the first Southern reading of the Emancipation Proclamation was read, where it was stated that slavery had ended in the South. These women took these seeds from that tree, or acorn, I should say, in 1935, and they grew them, and they established a seed, and they named it the Clark Oak after a pioneer educator in Virginia named N.B. Clark. And so it's also part of the cultural understanding, and not just Black culture does this, is naming a plant after somebody that you love and care about. It didn't matter that it came from the Emancipation Oak, which is essentially, I believe, a live oak tree. It's just that they named it after someone that was important and had the significance and rooted this seed from a highly important oak tree. And this Clark Oak was going gone on to be planted at the Booker T. Washington Elementary School, which is now middle school, in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia.
Is it still there?
Yes, the tree is still there, and there was an article that ran as recently, and I say recently, but it's fine because the tree's been around for hundreds of years now. In the 1990s, a woman who had gone to that school, speaking of, so Hillary and I, and for those of y'all watching on Facebook Live, Hillary is on the board here at Arboretum, and we were talking about people's spiritual connections to trees, and the woman was featured in this article in the 90s, went to that elementary school as a little girl, and she couldn't understand why she felt such a great connection to this tree. And one day, she was working at the school later on, many years later as a grown woman, and she was going through the archives, and she realized that it was the Clark oak, which was a baby of the Emancipation Oak. So that spiritual connection people feel is real. She just could not understand why she felt so connected to this tree as a child. So I spoke about Booker T. Washington, and regardless of how you feel about him, we won't get into his life today. He was indeed one of the most famous black men of his time, and also a controversial figure. And he's the Wizard of Tuskegee. And this is the HBCU, the Historical Black College and University, that has produced a mega amount of black foresters, black horticulturists, black agriculturists in America. And one of the things that he credited with his success, with being a star student and orator, and honestly self-made man who was born into slavery and rose from that, and discussed this in his autobiography of slavery. The follow-up to that autobiography is called Working with the Hand. And in that book, he goes into deep detail to talk about how nature impacted his life. And one of the things he wanted was to make sure that children understand how nature could move their life forward. So even if they maybe didn't see the hope or the possibility or the way out, nature always shows you that change can and will indeed happen. And this is a picture here. This is taken at the children's school at Tuskegee. And this is a school where the children of the professors at Tuskegee and also the townspeople went. And if you notice here, they're studying pine trees. And I know you can't see this picture. It is old. And it's a picture from Working with the Hand. And on the blackboard, it says, what are the uses of the pine? And they're discussing the size and the cone and the needles. And the point is this. What Washington writes is that if you are a student or a child and you're writing a letter, nothing will change until you come back the next day and finish that letter. But when you're dealing with a plant, when you're dealing with a tree, a seedling, no matter what, something has occurred, some change has happened in the middle of the night, every day. And it was to help children build intellectualism. And we don't think about that culturally, like trees really do help us be more acute in our awareness of things. And that can be taught at a very young age. And it's very interesting that he really wanted children to understand his things. So, and of course, as engaged as these children are, these children are going back in their communities and teaching their own friends, because at this point, education is still a privilege for many people. So I just wanted to acknowledge the power and connectivity that trees do have to children. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tuskegee. There's two more people I want to acknowledge here. This gentleman is David August Wilson. Can you see okay? Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right. David August Wilson is the man who becomes the first black landscape architect in the United States of America. He is a graduate of Cornell. He's the first black graduate in the College of Agriculture at Cornell. One of his professors is the famed Liberty Hyde Bailey. And David August Wilson goes on to have a landscape architecture career that runs well into his 90s. His 90s, y'all. He was really giving us landscapes for decades and decades and decades. Quite impressive. And one of the campuses that he laid out was Tuskegee. And he is handpicked to come on down to Tuskegee and teach children horticulture. He runs the landscape maintenance department there. And he also lays out alleys of trees, some of which you can see here in the photograph. And so he lays those out in the landscape. This gentleman is so into trees and horticulture and arboriculture. He is a member of the New York Botanic Gardens, and he is also a member of the American Society of Forests, American Forest Association. So a person who deeply had a high knowledge of trees and plants and impacted many young people for many generations and was able to teach them much about trees through his work at Tuskegee. Now, the fellow that you see here, this fine fellow who is painting, and we forget of how fabulous of an artist he is the one, the only George Washington Carver. So, I know you're like, here we go, another George Washington Carver story, but I tell people all the time, you wouldn't talk about Texas without mentioning Beyonce. You would not do that. So, of course, if we're going to talk about Tuskegee, no Tuskegee conversation happens without mentioning George Washington Carver. And we really do think about him as the peanut man, or sweet potatoes, or cotton, or soybean. But what people forget is that he wrote many publications, and many of them included knowledge of trees, ornamental trees, beautification, and the languaging that he used was such accessible language. And I'll talk a little bit about the way he wrote the words. And I felt that the way he wrote the words was the way that he saw the people, which would have been farmers in Alabama at the time, and encouraging them to plant these trees. So, this is one of the publications he wrote, and it is called Some Ornamental Plants of Macon County, Alabama, and that's the county that Tuskegee is in. So when he writes about dogwood, he talks about this being a tree that was made famous in story and song in the South. So you're like, ooh, a tree that was made famous in story and song. And he says that if you have the type of soil that you can plant corn and cotton, you can also plant a dogwood tree. And if you look in a tree book, we don't read it like that. So for him to even say, if you can plant corn and cotton in your soil, you can plant this tree. If I'm a farmer reading that, I know I can have dogwoods. I can have the same type of trees that you would have out in the Arboretum. And an interesting thing about the dogwood, especially as I'm an Atlanta girl, is at one point the city of Atlanta, well before my time, planted 1 million dogwoods in the city. So we still to this day have a dogwood festival. You see them everywhere, and yes, dogwood lights also everywhere. But in my city, in my town, dogwood was kind of established as the tree. Then he talks about the holly tree. And he talks about the berries, when he's, again, using this accessible language to the people. He says the berries are the size of black-eyed peas. So, yes, black people in Alabama knew exactly what he meant, and that's also a good way of tree ID, right? You see a tree, you're like, this might be a holly, but if it's not, the berry is the size of a black-eyed pea, you're going to think, maybe this isn't a holly, maybe this is something else. So, again, just rethinking how we can, I think, bring in more people and have a larger reach by how we use language. And that would have been something that they very much well understood, because black-eyed peas would have been beloved to many people in that community, including myself. And then he talks about the saucer magnolia, and he says that this is a tree where you can smell the fragrance for a quarter mile. So, of course, when you're planting, and he's writing in these books, in some ornamental plants for the southern landscape, and then also in his beautification books, he's letting people know these are the type of trees. Now, I chose these trees because they're hyper super southern, and these stories were pretty electric, but he also describes the shrubs very much in the same way. And this is a publication you can certainly find online through any type of historical text. And he also talks about a tree that has no peers and needs no description at all, and this is the eastern red cedar. And he talks about how this is a tree that is just an exciting, amazing tree, in that it can resist the mold and mildew and humidity of the South. And an interesting thing that I found out about this tree is that Native Americans also use this tree as the piece of wood to bury people on and carry them to their burial sites. So it was an important, super valuable tree. Now this one is the champion eastern red cedar tree in Georgia. And this has a 75-foot spread, and it is in a cemetery in Coffee County, Georgia. So a little bit hard to see here in the barn, but a huge, huge eastern red cedar. It's got a 57-foot height. So just pretty impressive. The folks on Facebook can see it a little better. And I want to talk about these. I kind of put this in the middle, but sometimes at the end we can be going, trying to make sure we stay within the time. These two books, Keep Your Head to the Sky and No Space Hidden, both of them have been written. One of them is co-authored by Gray Gunnifer, and the other one, who is a professor, I believe at William and Mary, and the other one is fully written by her. Now, she is an anthropologist. However, much of her work is in Black America. Hey, Beatrice. So So the baby woke up, y'all. So that means I'm doing a good job. The baby is paying attention. All right. So, much of what you'll see, the cultural relation, which I'm about to talk about in the next segment, these books are really great references. I find them fun to read. And I also want to be very clear that because some people may have been doing one thing in Alabama, that doesn't speak for all the South. It may have been different in South Carolina. So don't let my words to you today be some broad representation of all black people in America. It's not. It's nuanced culture, just like, anything. There's Irish people in Boston, and there are Irish people in Alabama, and I can promise you, they're different. They're just different. They're still Irish. So just know that there's a cultural range there, and these are, to me, really excellent books to read to give you a gauge on cultural understanding in Black America and trees. And she goes on to talk about much more than trees in these books, by the way. So one of the things that she talks about, she interviews a gentleman. His first name is Ishmael, and right now at the moment I forget his last name. It'll come to me, I'm sure, when I'm on the next slide. And what he does is that he talks about trees. He references them as celestial elevators. And I was like, I wish somebody would have told me that. I would have just, that knocked my socks off. I mean, honestly, it gives me chills saying it. And he said that trees connect the spirit world. They connect the earth to the sky and beyond, the spirit world where people have gone on to be. And really, when you look at trees, that's exactly what they do. They are celestial elevators for people. Trees are the coverings, almost a final resting place that covers people when they go home to the heavens, and they also are that reach for people. So some people have looked at trees in their lifetime as these celestial elevators, this connectivity to the great beyond. And then this is a picture of two gentlemen who work in the turpentine industry. This is a real postcard from back in the day. And trees, believe it or not, were used as indicators of travel. So, well, what does pine trees and turpentine have to do with travel? Well, I'm telling you, it would show that I have been on the road, I have seen some things, and I have been some places. So even though I'm a turpentine guy, I have hit these streets. And what they would do is that they would tie the wood from certain pines on top of their car. So the pines in the hill country would look different from the pine trees down in the delta. And if you had those woods tied on your car, people were like, oh, this man has a job. He is traveling. He is seeing things. He might be a high commodity. And so that is the way trees were used. And maybe I'm exaggerating a little, but basically it was like in 2021 we would call that a flex. Is what they were doing. They were flexing, showing that they had seen a lot of the country and using the pines as an indicator of that because the branching and bark and needles would be different. And then sometimes I think that we forget in terms of cultural association where trees really represent a region. So, if you receive a white oak basket in the South, there's a high probability that at least at one point it came from Appalachian country. And some rural white Americans would have made it. So that's what that would represent. If you receive a basket made out of pine, that probably came from the Sea Islands of Georgia. That would have been a cultural representation of them. Or maybe even something like you think about the palmetto basket, and that would have been Charleston, the Geechee Gullah culture. So even looking at the items around your home, and not just saying that's a basket, that was once a tree, or whatever it was. Where did it come from? What did those people, it just makes you think bigger and broader. How is that community impacted? Are they still making products native to that area from these oak trees, or ash trees, or pines in the case of Georgia? So just trees at a sense of place. Go ahead.
Those are like in Maine, our Native American ash baskets.
There you go. See, there we go. Maine Native American ash baskets. Did I say that right? Ash baskets.
Ash.
Okay. So, again, establishing a sense of place with trees, and not just it's a basket, but it also is a tree. It is something special. And thinking about trees as a place where celebrations happen. So, there was a time when African Americans, enslaved African Americans, would do their worship under trees. They would find the tree that had the branch with the special or irregular shape because they would believe that tree was more important and more valuable in terms of spirit. And then this is a beautiful picture of a baptism in South Carolina. And think about trees being these cathedrals where revivals happen, baptisms happen, celebrations happen. So all the energy that happens under trees, and it's not that this is just a river that was picked. This was also picked because of the location and the beautiful trees in the background. So what that means and how that actually changes, it informs the celebration just being around the trees. So I say this because telling someone like me, hey, we gotta protect these trees, the flight is coming, this moth is eating leaves, the heat index is starting to kill it, it's creeping. I get it. I'm all in. I'm a tree hugger, I want to fight it. Some people, that may not be enough to push them. But if you say these are the trees that your ancestors celebrated under, this is where the revival happened, this is where your great grandmama got baptized, then they're gonna say, now hold up, I'm gonna write a letter to my state senator because it matters to them. So we never know how people are drawn into the forest, but again, use it multiple ways, including the cultural way, to get them excited and get them interested in tree protection and conservation. Now, trees were also used as a host in terms of guardians of property. So there was also a time, and this is informed by a Congo tradition. So I'm talking about Congo, West Africa. Many enslaved people in the United States would have come from the west coast of Africa, not just the United States and the Americas. And there was a time that a skeleton hanging from a tree meant that if you come to this property and steal, then you could possibly become a skeleton. So yes, they weren't running around with shotguns, they were just hanging the skeleton in a tree, the skeleton of an animal, and that would ward off a thief. That would absolutely do that. That would be a sign, this might be bad karma to you. So, and sometimes, I'm not even gonna lie, I remember seeing this. So I grew up in Atlanta, but on the weekends we go to Barnesville, Georgia, my mom's hometown, dirt road country. And not on her farm, but I do remember seeing this in those rural counties and areas around it, but I never knew what it meant as a child. And it wasn't until I was older and doing research and understanding more of Gundy's work where I see that. Now, that doesn't mean that the person put it there to ward off evil, but what we do know is this, sometimes people just copy what their grandmama did. Now, their grandmama could have been doing it for that reason. Maybe by the time I came around, people weren't. But, again, we lose some of this cultural knowledge when time moves on and generations die and elders aren't able to pass on the story. And then also hanging baskets. So when we think of hanging baskets, we think cocoa liners, we think better homes and gardens, geraniums, make it pretty. And there was a time that hanging baskets in trees, again, would ward people off. And it would, especially in a fruit tree. And a person may think, a hanging basket's in that tree, I shouldn't take that fruit. It may make me unfertile. Now, I'm not saying that you don't listen to the science. I know that doesn't make you unfertile. However, what we do know is that the symbolism of that, and also the symbolism of telling someone, don't steal from me, don't steal my fruit, that will be bad luck, bad karma to you. And the reason I bring this up about the hanging basket is because I also think about when we discourage people from practicing the way they would have practiced, the way their ancestors did, and informing the way that they hang their baskets in their trees, how does that impact landscape design? Because now when you see it, you really do see the cocoa liner as the hanging basket. What would have happened if people still used real basket? How would the design, would it have been different? So are we influencing people by impressioning on them how they would use hanging baskets in their landscape, specifically as they relate to trees? And is it acceptable? Your neighbor's not weird if they just want to hang a real basket in a tree. That's their thing. That's their jam, that's their vibe, let them do it. Now also trees. So this is, I'm going to walk y'all through this picture. There is a glare in here. It is a sunny, hot, humid Atlanta day in the middle of May. I think I brought it with me. I keep telling everybody that. So you see the bottle tree. I think we've all seen that. But one of the sad origins of the bottle tree was that west coast of Africa, again I'm referencing the Congo culture, through the research of Gundy for here. Now, it would you see the insect here, the beetle here, with this really beautiful metallic shell to it. And so the word that she uses for this is trees and the spiritual glitter. So this would have been a way to reflect and ward off evil. And after over time, the idiom where the insect wasn't represented, people see your Christmas lights. They don't come to see that hanging up. They come to see your spiritual gifts. And that's what, that's pretty cool. Now, this photograph here, this is from, I want to say the 1920s. Let's just say early 1900s. And this is a picture of a home in Georgia. This is in the back, the white area in the far back, that is the home of the extension agent. That's an old home, and he just moved on up like the Jeffersons, George Jefferson, Lauren. I know you're young, but there's this thing like moving on up. And he's built a new home. He didn't come up. It is the blow up. So he didn't tear down his old shack, but he kept the mansion in the front. So you notice here that the trees are painted white at the bottom. And many times people look at that and say, oh, well, that's what people in orchards did. And that was a way to ward off the insects. And that would be maybe a pecan orchard or a fruit orchard or whatever it is. So using that paint. Now, what I noticed, and this is something that I think I would love to see studied, and I'm using my own hypothesis. This man was an extension agent, and we know that extension is an extension of, it's pretty much mobile ag university coming out into the community. So, this is why we got to keep our antenna up at all times. So I've noticed this, I've seen these my whole life. So these are what they call the Greek trees. So in the middle you see Delta Sigma Theta, you see Alpha Kappa Alpha. These are representative of the Divine Nine, which are the 9 historically black fraternities and sororities at HBCUs, historically black college and universities. So, let me walk you through this. These pictures were taken at Howard University. That's my brother's alma mater in Washington, D.C. And many people know Howard now because Vice President Kamala Harris graduated from there. And these trees are on the yard. And the yard is the gathering area for everybody on campus. And especially, Howard is a black campus. And at Auburn and many of the other, what we call PWIs, predominantly white institutions, Beatrice, you were fine. She's saying, yeah, keep saying it. She's cheering me on. I got you know how it's like a call and response. I feel like that's what I'm getting, like the church. So back to these Greek trees. What we got to be clear about is Howard, Tuskegee, Clark, Atlanta, Fisk, FAMU, Florida A&M University. These were a bunch of country boys, and women, and folks going into these universities back in the day. And it makes me often wonder, were they at one point, when these Greek organizations were established, such as 1908, Alpha Kappa Alpha, were they mimicking what they saw in their original landscape? So the painting of the trees, and then if you look at this Delta tree, it's painted halfway down, just like the orchard tree. Now, the next thing people say to me is, well, what about the tree, April Lee? Is the paint hurting the tree? I don't know. I'm not saying that, yes, we need to use paint on trees or a bad type of paint. What I am saying is that these students are engaged. These trees are sacred trees on these campuses. Do the students know what type of tree it is? Do they know that they can grow up and be arborists or work in forestry or work around trees? So I look at it as a way of engagement, and I also look at it as a way of artistic engagement with the trees. So I'm not saying, again, go out and paint trees with bad paints. What I'm saying is that these students care about these trees, and that means that there's interest, and that is an entryway to let more people in culturally and excite them about the campus that we love so much. And now I'm going to talk about some exciting tree people. So, some of y'all may recognize this person. This is Colonel Charles Young. This is the first black superintendent of a national park. Now, Colonel Charles Young, this ain't just anybody. This is a man that played, I think he played 13 instruments. He spoke multiple languages, including languages like German. Just casual things, right? You don't just know people that speak German. And he was also the first black graduate of West Point. Had a hard time there. But we're here to talk about the extraordinary work that he did at Sequoia National Park in California. And he led a group at that park, a group of Buffalo soldiers, in the summer in the early 1900s. And during that summer, there's a wonderful story about him you can find online. Just type in Charles Young National Park Service. And I want to point this out before I forget, because I always forget. All these little dots you see here, this is Arlington National Cemetery. This is this man's funeral. So this is how big of a deal he is when he passes away. Thousands of people show up. But the point is this. At Sequoia National Park, Charles Young goes in with the Buffalo Soldiers and completes these roads that we still drive on today to go see the beautiful, majestic redwood trees. He even negotiated with people who were landowners in the area at the time to protect the trees and to expand the national parks. And what his crew was able to do in the summer, other teams were not able to do in years ahead of him. And that is how hard they worked, and that is how important he is to the National Park Service and to the tree legacy of America. And when we talk about the giants of trees, we have to include his name more often in what he did and how he negotiated to protect that land out in California so we can enjoy the redwoods today. And another person I want to talk about, this young man that you see here, who is super important to American tree history, is Ralph Elwood Rock. He is the first black man to graduate with a degree in forestry. And he graduates from what is Penn State, Mount Alto. And even now they've named the tree nursery there after him. Now, Ralph Elwood Rock goes to school at Howard High School in Delaware, Wilmington, Delaware, which was a pretty famous elite black high school during his time. And this Howard High School is also named after the same general that Howard University is named after. So, Ralph Elwood Rock goes to Penn State. He starts with 13 people in his forestry class, only 6 make it out, and he is one of those people. He runs the nursery there for many years. He goes on to have his own landscape company, own his own nursery, do very, very well in the tree industry, and he also faced a lot of segregation. A lot of people didn't like this black man being their boss. And this is a younger picture of him, so there are pictures of him older in his life. However, he persisted, and I'm not saying that you have to deal with abuse on the job at all, but what I am saying is that Ralph Elwood Rock did what he had to do and was able to work in these conditions because of his love for trees. So when we think about tree heroes, Ralph Elwood Rock is absolutely at the top of the list, and is not just a hero for Pennsylvania, he's a hero for trees in America. Now, I'm not going to talk about the first black man with a forestry degree and not talk about the first black woman. Yes, I'm going to bring my sisters into the room and acknowledge and be excited for them. The woman that you see here, it's hard to see on the left. Her name is Audrey Calhoun, but she's sitting there with her professor. Audrey Calhoun graduated from Grambling University in Louisiana. And she was born in Winfield, Louisiana. It's okay. We're in a barn, y'all. It's an arboretum. This is live TV. This is what you do. And this is, so there's Beatrice. See, you get an outdoor tree career. This is what happens. This is what happens. It happens in real time. So, back to Miss Calhoun here. Winfield, Louisiana is in the middle of a national forest. And so I kind of feel like she was fated to be in the tree industry. She goes to Grambling to graduate, and then she goes on to Louisiana Tech to get her master's in zoology. However, while she's there, one of her professors says, well, what do you think about majoring in forestry? And I'm like, well, she's like, well, I never thought about that, and she just does it. So why do I bring that up? Sometimes people just don't know what they don't know. It is really as easy as tapping someone on the shoulder and say, hey, what do you know about biology? What about a career here? I know you're 5. This might be a lot to ask in life, but hey, trees may matter to you somewhere down the road. So just introducing folks to things that they're just not thinking about. And I can use my own self for an example. When I grew up, my dad was director of parks for the city of Atlanta. At one point in my childhood, it never occurred to me, go major in horticulture. Be around arboretums, never. I was 2.5 years into Auburn, and I said, I think I'm going to try horticulture. And I grew up going to a farm every weekend. So again, people just don't know or think about the things they don't know. Audrey Calhoun goes on to be the first woman, she believes, especially black woman, working at Yellowstone National Parks. She talks about learning to jump over mud holes and taking the occasional slap in the face from trees and having this real love of trees. Now, of all the people I show you today, this woman, as far as we know, is still alive. And I know this because I'm weird, and I Googled her, and I even left a voicemail. And of course, she didn't call me back because that's probably just too weird. But I just want to thank her and acknowledge her for her work. And I do actually hope to meet her one day because this woman is still alive. We can record her story. We can't go back and ask Ralph Elwood Rock is. We can't talk to Colonel Charles Young. That's my alarm just telling me it's 4:40. Doing great on time here, by the way. So I'm going to cut it off. But we can ask Audrey Calhoun. We absolutely can. So guess I'm gonna be weird again and reach out in 2023. Give her a break. And another person I want to tell you about, so actually two people still alive. This is Mr. Roland Jefferson, the iconic black botanist from the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. So Roland Jefferson is a graduate of Howard University, and it took him 7 years to get a job at the Arboretum there. And when he finally got a job, though he got a degree in botany, they hired him to make labels, and they really didn't think that he was, smart enough to do the work. Now, this is a man who grew up in Washington, D.C., and his father introduced him to the cherry tree. So, what is so special about Roland Jefferson and these cherry trees? Well, while he was working at the U.S. Arboretum, he noticed that the cherry trees, the beautiful ones that we see on the Potomac River, were starting to die out. So those original trees planted during the Taft administration, Roland Jefferson and Alex Pusoni, I hope I said his name right, his last name is definitely Pusoni, co-authored a book on the Japanese flowering cherry trees of Washington, D.C. And Roland Jefferson goes in and takes that tree stock, because I think only less than 10% of the original tree stock was left, and they were able to root new trees and create lineage, right, progeny from those trees. So the original Taft trees, their lineage is still alive today because of Mr. Roland Jefferson and having that eagle eye and noticing that those trees were dying out. Now, from all that I know, and the last that I checked, in a recent article in, fairly recent, like 2016, 2017, in the Washington Post, he's in his 90s and living in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I show this picture because this is the 1960s. Roland Jefferson's on the right. This is one of the mayors of, I forgot the word, but the way Tokyo is set up, it's got different areas to it, and this is one of the mayors of one of those areas. Prefectures. Thank you. Say that again. Prefectures. Prefectures. Thank you. So why is this important? This man is a rock star in Japan. They know who he is. They're bringing him over there as a person of honor. We don't really even know him like that. And that's crazy how the Japanese knew to honor and respect his work surrounding their trees. But in America, he's just some guy in Hawaii. He is not just some guy in Hawaii. He is Mr. Roland Jefferson, the icon. And we got to say his name and speak his story so it's never forgotten. So I want to talk about why some people's stories are often forgotten. These are men and women at Magnolia Garden and Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, at that public garden at Magnolia, once the Civil War ended, the Drayton family brought back the formerly enslaved people. They brought them back on as tour guides because they needed income. Nobody's, coming around. There's no money around, and they opened up the plantation as a public garden. And I think that they claim to be the first public garden, but a lot of people do, so who knows? I don't know. But for this story, they're going to be the first. Now, the formerly enslaved people, let's be very clear, they laid out the landscape of this plantation. They're the ones that walked you through the sandy, swampy soil. They're the ones that identified the oak trees, the magnolia trees, every type of tree that was there, azalea, rhododendron. They're the ones that put it in. And what we call that work now is landscape architecture. But when it's enslaved people, it's just work. So, why are people like this ignored? I want to mention the two people that you can kind of see. So the man on the left here is a man that's called Uncle Frazier. And the man on the right is the woman, the woman on the right is the woman called Aunt Phoebe. You see her with the broom. Notice that there's a swept yard here, by the way, with a broomstick made of trees and tree branches. And look at their outfits and the way I said their names in their quotes, and I'll explain why. These people are often ignored, these tree experts, or these plant experts, or why I think they're often ignored. So here's a close-up picture of Aunt Phoebe, and I call her that in air quotes because during the time in the South, people, specifically white people, were not going to address older black people with honorific titles, such as Madam or Mrs., and that's why you get Aunt Jemima or Old Uncle Frazier, like he's your buddy or something like that. And they're not your buddy, and they're not even really your aunt and uncle unless they really are. And so, if anything, we owe her the name Miss Phoebe. And let's also know this is a dark-skinned black woman. She's not a Mary Pete. I got a French daddy, fair skin, I got curly hair. Colorism, I'm not saying that Mary Pete didn't experience racism, but I am saying that colorism is also a level and a layer that people experience. And a dark-skinned dark-skinned black woman dressed in mammy attire, and so you do see Hattie McDaniel here. That was probably most famous from Gone with the Wind. No one's going to look at her as a tree expert. No one's going to look at her as having knowledge. No one's going to look at her as like, wow, this woman really knows the forest out here. They're going to look at her as a servant and Aunt Phoebe. And really, this is what she is. She's an arborist. She's all these things that we call everyone else today. So sometimes it can just be our appearance historically that makes people not want to give us our credit. But just look around and think about how we think about people, not just black people, but other people in situations that may have been ignored, and look at those historical pictures and say, you know, they probably weren't just kind of working there. They probably really had all the real knowledge. So, we're going to talk about some hope now. I took you down the little dark hill. I'm going to bring you back up. Yeah, but we got to keep it real, right? We have to be honest. There's no other way. So, truly, the tree of hope. So, this is the Lafayette Theater in Harlem, New York. It is the 1920s. It is popping. All the entertainers are coming out of here. Billboard, James Robinson, Ethel Waters. This is the place you get discovered, and it is hard to see with the glamour. When I tell you this is packed full of black folks in suits, fancy cars, ready to go see a show, that's exactly what that is. Outside of the Lafayette Theater stands a tree. And people stand under that tree hoping to get discovered. They love this tree. They call it the tree of hope. They touch the bark. They pull a leaf off. And I'm not saying you should pull leaves off the trees, but this is where entertainers get discovered and often end up becoming famous. So it wasn't, people thought the tree brought them luck, but really what was happening is that a bunch of talent was gathering under this tree. So the city, this tree is beloved, and I mean it's beloved. The city of New York comes along and decides, we're going to widen the sidewalk, cut this tree down. And that's exactly what they do. And this is a picture of some young boys standing around what's left of the tree stump. Now this tree is so beloved, people are buying pieces of the tree that's cut down. This is the tree that has changed people's lives and created wealth and put them on to fame and fortune. And it's so popular that there is even obituaries written for this tree. I'll read a little bit about it. It says, the tree of hope, for long it rained, thespians thought it brought them fame. They touched this trunk, you hear them say, I hope you bring them up today. New York City said the tree must go, that grand old tree that they love so. And amongst their souvenirs, you'll see remnants of that tree of hope by Dorothy Wood. So it matters. It really matters to these folks. It matters so much that one lady proposed, well, why don't we create what they have an Academy Award, but make it what the tree of hope looked like. Now, I told y'all people was pulling on this tree, and that's why it did look raggedy. It looked bad. I do admit. But this was called the Tree of Hope Award for the best actor of the season from 1952 to 1953. And it says, I just kind of blew up what the proposal was, presented to John Doe. So whoever would have been the best actor in Harlem at the time. Here's the thing, we don't know if this award was ever made or given. Somebody knows. I bet somebody's grandma was at it somewhere in New York. We know, but this is what the tree meant. This is what it meant to people. Now, I talked about this stump. So there was a man, this man is named Ralph Cooper. And I always say this is funny, but it's not funny, but to me it's absolutely hilarious. They called him Dark Gable instead of Clark Gable because he was debonair and suave and wavy hair, very much like the gentleman. What's my man's name in Gone with the Wind? It's Clark Gable. Clark Gable. So, this gentleman, Ralph Cooper, gets the biggest piece of stump and saves it because it's like, this is a tree. Oh, I'm not going to let this go. And he asked the stagehand to mount the stump on a plinth, what do you call those little things that, I'm going to show you. You tell me what it's called.
Pedestal.
Pedestal, thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. He says, mount this on the pedestal. I want you to do a stage left. Or maybe a stage right. You theater people let me know. So, because the Lafayette Theater shuts down, and everybody goes on to the Apollo Theater in New York. So, yes, this tree stump. And I know that Barbara and Hillary probably remember this. There was a show called Showtime at the Apollo, and it would come on, and you touch that tree trunk, and you go out there and perform. You might get booed. The people at the Apollo will boo you. But if they cheer you on, you're probably going to go on to good luck and success and things like that. So, James Brown, last night, Beyonce, you know I mentioned her twice today because she's worthy. Many people went on, my alarm went off to tell me it's 4:50, and we're almost to the end. Many people touch the stump. So the tree of hope still does exist. It was saved, and just again, what trees mean to people's culture. So thank you, Ralph, for saving this tree. Now I will move through these next slides. I know it was hot, humid. It feels like we are in Tipton, Georgia, not Augusta, Maine. But this is not a light-skinned white woman. This actually is a white woman, and this is Theodora Hamlet. This is a famous artist from Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi. And she talks, and what she's famous for is being a memory artist. I'm going to show you two of those today. And these pictures, Google her pictures online, they're beautiful. What it is that she paints each leaf individually, and she said that I try to paint the trees. I try to paint the trees the way they were before they were slain. So this is the way she remembers the trees in the fall of Mississippi before the people came down and cut them down. So again, what trees is a central place and what they meant to people, and she uses these really bright and vibrant colors. And this may not even be her most beautiful tree picture, but Theodora Hamlet is her name, and her tree art is beautiful. Now, another woman, more famous for her zinnia art, the flowers and zinnias, but this is Clementine Hunter. And Clementine Hunter is out of Louisiana, and this was, she's also a folk artist. She was the first black folk artist to get famous. She was in her 50s when she started painting her art, and she lived to be over 100 years old. And this was one of the famous lemon tree paintings. And so, again, she's also a memory artist in painting the memories of her beloved flowers and trees from this plantation. She never really left in Louisiana that she grew up on. And if you read into her story, things that are important to her, she'll make them bigger. And that's why this lemon tree is so exaggerated compared to the person. The lemons are so big because the tree meant so much to her. And there she is. This is Clementine Hunter with her fabulous cat eye glasses. So I want to talk to you all a little bit about W.B. Du Bois, the first black man to graduate from Carver with a PhD, and also the editor of the Crisis magazine, which was the official publication of the NAACP. And one thing I don't think we give Du Bois enough credit about is really being on the side of environmentalism in this time. I think people just think about him as black intellectualism, and that's just not the case. This young man that you see is Richard Lonsdale Brown, and Du Bois hired him a few times, and he did die young. He ended up dying fairly young in his 20s. Hired him a few times to do covers for the Crisis, and this is a man who was born in West Virginia, grew up there, and would often reflect the nature scenes, including the trees. And the Crisis magazine is a magazine that's talking about Jim Crow, segregation, how to advance Black America during the time. But when they're doing environmental covers, they're bringing in people like Richard Lonsdale Brown to celebrate trees. Also, it wasn't just the covers of the magazine, it was the content inside. This woman that you see here is Effie Lee Newsom. Effie Lee Newsom is a Harlem Renaissance poet, and inside of the Crisis magazine, she is the editor of the children's pages. And specifically, this section is the Brownies book. And so she uses nature. This is a woman who grew up, her dad was president of Wilberforce University. Her dad is Bishop Robert Lee Newsom. I think his first name is Robert, but she grew up in a very elite black family, very much so. But she uses trees as a way during the Jim Crow era to let little black children know you matter, you're beautiful, and I'm going to show you you're beautiful because I'm going to compare you to a tree. Now, I'm not going to read this whole poem to you, but it's called The Bronze Legacy. And what she starts off the poem saying, "'Tis a noble gift to be brown all around." So she's acknowledging you're brown. It's a gift. It's a gift. You're melanin. Even like the very land, even like the trunks of trees. And she goes, even oaks to be like these. So these little black and brown children, it's not that I'm black and I'm less than and I deserve to have a hard life down here in the South. It's like, I'm the same color as an oak tree. I am mighty. I have power. And I love how she uses nature to engage children culturally. Newsom goes on to write a book called Glad Yellow Garden, and it is illustrated by a black woman named Lois Mason Jones, and I'll show you her picture coming up. And another thing I want to point out is that it was published by the Associated Press. This was 1940, so it's essentially a book of eco-poetry for black children. The Associated Publishers is Carter G. Woodson's publishing house. And Carter G. Woodson is the gentleman who founded Negro History Week, which we now call Black History Week. So a lot, not no 6 degrees of separation. We're talking about like 2 with all these people. Colonel Charles Young was one of W.B. Du Bois' best friends, so it's a lot of layers to this thing, really. 4:55, but it's only a few more slides, Laura. Okay. This is Lois Maylou Jones, and this is a woman who went to art school in Boston. She studied in Paris. She spent her summers on Martha's Vineyard, and she was the head of the art department at Howard University for decades. And I want to say she also was in her 80s or 90s. I think she passed away in around 98. But what I want to show you is some of the artwork inside of Gladiola Garden, this book of children's nature poetry. If you Google it online, you can either buy it or you can go through a digital copy that the New York Public Library has. So, super important. A black woman writes a book of nature poetry to black children in the 1940s, and a black woman illustrates. That's a big deal. It's a very big deal. So, this is the illustration of Lois Maylou Jones, and then this is a poem of Eckerly Newsom. In the interest of time, I wasn't going to read y'all all this poetry, by the way. I realize it's not a poetry slam. I just wanted to show y'all that there's a whole section in the book dedicated to trees, and it is beautiful. And again, just drawing these little black children here. And then this is another one. And again, Lois Maylou Jones isn't here to answer these questions because honestly, her most famous art wasn't from this book. It was from many other things that she did. But you even see here the black and the white in the trees. And this is the poem before was about leaves. This one was about wind-stirred trees. This one is about the secret, and it's talking about buds. So it says, I used to think the trees were bare when leaves had blown away, but I found hosts of buds wait there to open some spring day. That's how beautiful these poems are. And again, Lois Maylou Jones illustration. What I do point out, I realize this is a flower picture, and this is a tree top. But what I want to show, which is very important, I talk about Miss Phoebe being dark skinned, and look at how Jones illustrates a range of black children in the book. A little light-skinned black child, a dark one, and she's not exaggerated with big lips and these crazy googly-eyed features where she's a caricature. She draws her as a beautiful black child with coarse hair, with a bulbous nose, with full lips, and enjoying nature in a real way, and that's what you'll see. And that is super important to capture during that time. So, this man right here, I am sharing the Apple King, okay? The Apple King. So we're getting to the finale. We are going to get out of here on time. This is William J. Anderson. This Apple King is a gentleman who was the president at one time of the Horticultural Society of Vermont. He had over 100 acres, and 65 of them were dedicated to apples. He gave speeches for horticultural societies in other states, including places in New York, and he even gave a speech to the Pomological Society in Quebec, Canada, because he was such an apple expert. And today, Lauren drove me right by those main heritage apples. So, he didn't just give this speech in Quebec about apples and his expertise as an apple expert. He turned around and gave it in French. So, I told you, it's not that these tree people are exciting, it's these secret hidden talents that they have. Just the people in Quebec weren't expecting it, and he actually said he gave the speech in English, and he said, now I'm going to turn around and give it in French. And they were like, ooh, as they should have been, because they didn't know he could do that. This black man also goes on to be the first black state legislator in the state of Vermont, and he employs 100 people. His employees are white. He's in Vermont. And in 1943, his apple sales are at $125,000. In today's money, that's about $1.9 million. So this ain't just anybody. So why am I showing y'all this man from Vermont and you're in Maine? Well, number one, he also was a pioneer and honestly an expert in advancing the size and also how many apples will be produced on a tree. So he advanced variety. And I say this because I'm from the great state of Georgia. We aren't going to let Alabama and Mississippi show us up. So if there is a tree story like this coming out of Vermont, you got one in Maine, y'all. You got one. And I was telling the crowd yesterday, I was at Coastal Maine, for those of y'all at home. In 1920, we know that there were 42,000 farmers in the state of Maine. We know that 13 of them were black. And what is very important about them being black is that those 13 black people, it said in the census records, they owned their land. So that means that there is a record of these people somewhere. So they were farmers. We don't know. Were they tree farmers? Were they have apples? What was going on here? So don't let Vermont show y'all up. We wouldn't let Mississippi do it. I would go dig a tree story out of a hole in Barnes if I had to. So, and this is your this is pretty exciting. This is really cool stuff. Now, I want to be very clear. this story does have a tragic end. I'm taking a very real turn. And this gentleman, it is reported that he died by suicide. And I say allegedly, because I got to tell you, this man's a state legislator. He is selling $125,000 worth of apples in Vermont in the 1940s. That's what they say happened. I don't know. Maybe it did. But I say put an asterisk next to that. Because he was found shot to death. And they say, oh, he just shot him. So it's not like he had a lot to lose. But I don't know. We weren't there. And we don't know. Actually, there's a lot about this story. But this is like a Hollywood movie. That's why I brought that up. I didn't mean to just bring up his death in such a bad way. Lord, forgive me. I was just like, there's excitement, there's money, there's fame, there's politics, and then there's tragedy. So, trees, they're Hollywood, y'all. They are the full shebang of storytelling. So, I want to end with this final slide to say this. I don't know these people, but I want y'all to view trees culturally the way I view them. So, when I see a picture like this, first of all, I notice these are black people dressed in some super fancy clothes here. So is it wealth, or are they just showing up and saying, you know what, I'm going to go take me a pretty picture today? And at this time, this is likely wealth. They weren't probably just running around with these clothes just hanging in their closet. The next thing to notice here is that this is birch tree, and this is birch bark that has been harvested. And that is a Native American technique where you cut the birch bark off and you can use it to make a canoe or a basket or a bag to hold water. So, were they Afro-Native American? Did the Native Americans teach them this? Did they own this tree field, or did they just roll up on it one day to take a picture? We don't know. But it's asking, in my mind, we have a lot of questions to ask here. So don't just pass by a tree picture when you pass and not look at the things in it and say birch bark harvesting, black people, well, was this their birch bark forest here? We don't know. So the fact that we don't know so much more of these stories, and it's not just, again, black American tree history. This is our history in America, and this is culture to be shared. So, Val's Arboretum, I thank y'all so much. And if you know a story that I should tell, I would love to include Maine and Conquer the Soil. It's not too late. It's September 2022. Y'all want to get in there? I need a picture. Vermont's getting in there. Don't let your neighbor show you that. Okay. So thank you so much for coming today. It is Friday. It is 5 o'clock. Y'all are wonderful to be here, and I'm so, so grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Damn, I got a little special prize for y'all. Lauren and Barbara have got theirs, but I will have that for you two ladies. So I'll let you choose, actually.